that. You'll be aware, for example, of the work that QQI is doing with the Higher Education National Academic Integrity Network. On another front, for example, QQI has been working in partnership with the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning over the past few months on exploring issues that arise in the context of assessment of learning in the workplace. And that work will culminate in a symposium later on this year, the 19th of November, which some of you may be interested in attending. But today's event is about another aspect of assessment, namely the assessment in a blended learning context. Assessment is really important. It's difficult to overstate the importance of assessment in further education and higher education. And developing valid and reliable assessment instruments is technically very challenging. And unfortunately, this can sometimes give rise to nervousness or caution about innovation in assessment. The COVID-19 crisis demanded extensive modifications to assessment arrangements and gave rise to an opportunity for reflecting on how assessment is done. Some of the changes, I've no doubt, that people made during the crisis will probably be the basis of new practice post-crisis. In particular, there's been a dramatic increase in the volume of blended teaching, learning, and assessment, and there's a huge deal of interest in sharing insights in this area. And we hope that this blended learning assessment series will facilitate such sharing. So all the presentations in this series, and this is the second in the series, will be by practitioners who are actively engaged in developing practical solutions for assessing learners validly, reliably, in various blended contexts. We've asked the presenters to emphasize how they go about finding solutions, the principles they find useful, the reasoning underpinning their approaches, and how they evaluate their approaches. This is important because the solutions themselves will be valid for specific situations, and they may not translate as easily as the methods for finding and evaluating the solutions. So we want this series to help you figure out how to evaluate solutions, how to quality assure innovations in assessment or applications of assessment in the blended learning context. Today's presentations are largely situated in the context of teacher education programs, but we hope the insights will be of wider interest, particularly across the humanities, but maybe beyond that, given what I said before. Before I introduce the program itself in detail and the first speaker, I'd like to highlight two things or stress two things. First of all, QQI want this series to be as useful as possible to you. And we invite your feedback on how we can do better and what we might do to enhance the utility of this series for you. So please give us your ideas in the chat or come back to us by email afterwards. Secondly, in the context of our green paper on assessment, we'd also like you to just think about what QQI needs to be doing in the more general space of assessment. What could we do to help enhance confidence in assessment, to enhance the quality assurance of assessment and of learners and of learning outcomes? So to today, the substantial part of today's program comprises three 20-minute presentations, and we're going to run them one after the other. And they will be followed by a 15-minute session for questions, and that will be followed by a wrap-up by my colleague, Ciarán Maguire. If questions occur to you during the presentations, I'd ask you to put them in the chat, and be collecting those questions and we'll put them to the speakers at the end, in that question session at the end of the presentations. I'd like to formally advise you that we're recording this event, and we will be circulating a link to the recording afterwards. I'd also like to ask you to keep your microphones muted while you're not speaking, in order to help maintain the quality of the audio. And finally, I'd like to ask the speakers to keep an eye on the time. My colleague Laura will be giving a 2-minute warning to each of the speakers. Unfortunately, I haven't got mine yet, which is good, because I'm just about finished. And I'd like to finish then by inviting our first speaker to make her presentation, and that first speaker is Mary Kelly, head of the School of Education at Hibernia College. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you here today to present, I suppose, some of our experiences and some of the things that we've learned and gained over the last number of years as we've worked in a blended learning environment. So this afternoon, we have, I suppose, a number of things that we hope to get through with you. The session aims are to examine principles of assessment design in a blended learning environment. So I suppose just to give you context, as Peter said, our college is predominantly teacher education. We have a professional master's program in primary education and post-primary education, and approximately 2,000 students across the college. So we've been working in a blended learning environment for almost 20 years, but even with that, I suppose, you know, COVID has posed challenges for us, and we'd like to share some of those experiences with you today. We're also joined by our colleague, Dr. Melanie Dhuinn from Trinity College, who also works in a teacher education program, and she'll share some of their findings as well. So we'll examine 2 case studies in particular. We will look at oral Irish exams, which are part of the primary programme, and alternative school placement. So I think it's probably worth stating that, you know, they're professional programmes, so they have a professional practice piece that's really important, and it was difficult and challenged us all, I suppose, in light of COVID, as to how we would move from assessing what was traditionally school placement, where we would be out in schools with students, and then having to alternatively assess them, and as Peter said, meet the learning outcomes, maintain the standards, and ensure that they were robust assessments, that we could all stand over the quality of the students that we were graduating, because that is paramount to us, that we want to uphold and maintain the standards, and I think we all share that goal. And I suppose we'll reflect through the next sort of hour or so and rethink our own assessment approaches, and see where we can go and what we can learn from them. So I suppose just the next slide just shows us really that assessment is, it's a blended learning. Blended learning is face-to-face learning and online learning. So when the two come together, that is blended learning. And there's lots of terminology, lots of different language used for them. But I suppose really what it is, it's an alignment between the two, when the face-to-face and the online constructively align, and the student is brought on a journey where both are partners. So what they're experiencing online is mediated face-to-face, and that they really have a holistic experience. Now, as I said, I suppose COVID has shifted a lot of us online fully, but you know, the context today is about blended learning, and ensuring that we think, what are the principles, what are the key things, what constructive alignment do we need to have between the two, so that there is a student experience, that they know what's happening, and they experience it fully. So really, I suppose, in thinking about, and I'll just move to the next slide, and thank you, Laura, for presenting for us there. So really, it has to be a strategic approach. And what I've done here is, I suppose I've tried to look at all of the elements that are crucial to ensuring that you have a really defined strategic approach to blended learning, and to that assessment. And there's a number of factors. Obviously, there's the program design, there's the digital learning piece, there's the system support, and then there's the quality assurance. And to ensure a really robust system, all of those have to be talking to each other and have to be sharing insights and have to be working together. So we all know that we've been accredited. We have our program learning outcomes, we have our module learning outcomes, and we have our assessments that we've all set out in our various documentation. And we have to, adhere to those in a blended learning environment. We have to ensure that the teaching, learning and assessment strategy is designed to ensure that the student meets those program learning outcomes and module learning outcomes. And we have to put in learner supports around teaching, learning and assessment that will ensure that the student graduates and moves through the program in a seamless fashion. But when you come to a blended learning environment, it's crucial that you work closely with the digital learning team. So, and I think what I would like to say, from the outset is that, all of these work together, but really what drives it is the pedagogy, it is the academic structure, it is the learning outcomes, it is the student experience. That has to be at the forefront of any kind of blended learning program that you have. It can't be a case that the technology or the IT systems are dictating and you're trying to marry them in. You must always be teaching and learning are at the heart of everything we do, and assessment is part of that as well, in ensuring that there is that really good outcome for students. But within the digital learning part, I suppose you are looking at what are the, what tools are there, what best meets, what can you do to support the learner, what, what's innovative, what's creative, what's there, how can you, if an academic has an idea about something, the digital learning team can support that in realizing that for the academic. And then obviously the system supports. So there's no point in us all having these wonderful ideas about doing X, Y, and Z if the systems that underpin the structure, the infrastructure of it all, doesn't support it. And for example, something very, very simple. You may, as an academic, decide that you want students to present, YouTube videos or blogs or vlogs or whatever. But if they're all uploading at the same time and your system crashes, then that's a difficulty for you. So you have to work very closely with the IT team in deciding, what is it that we can actually do on a given day if students are submitting. Is there a file size? Is there a size that they can't go above? What is the content management? Who manages the VLE? Where are those assignments going to sit? Who's going to manage the grade book that goes with them? So all the technical pieces that come behind your ideas and your innovation have to be really important. And I suppose finally, and it's not in any order here, but the academic rigor, the quality assurance framework and the governance piece has to be central. And certainly when many of us moved in COVID to alternative assessments, it was absolutely crucial that we ensured that the governance was there, that things were checked with academic board, with external examiners, that we all had our I's dotted and our T's crossed from that quality. Because at the end of the day, as I said, we have to be able to stand over the awards that we're giving to students and the academic rigor that we have within our programs. So really it is a strategic approach. It has to be a team effort. It has to be a solution focused piece where you're all working together to say, well, what is the best way forward in terms of supporting the students? And so just to move to the next slide then, if you could think about, I suppose, blended learning and designing assessments in different ways, the next way would be, I suppose, I think of it in terms of 4Ds: to discover, to dream, to design, and deliver. Okay, so where are you now? Discovering, what do you have now? What's at your beck and call? What have you discovered about assessment so far? What do you know? What are students saying to you? What capabilities do you have digitally? What quality assurances do you need to put in place? So you've got to think about all of those areas and figure that all out before you can actually move to really ensuring that you're going to get to your end goal. Dreaming, having an aim. What is your vision for this? Where do you want to be? What innovation do you want to bring in? What strategy do you have? Does it fit into your teaching, learning and assessment strategy that is already there? Or what principles of assessment and design are you going to? Making sure that you're suiting the needs of all learners. We've all got different types of learners on our programs, and ensuring that we're not just giving essays, we're not just asking students to do the same module after module, but that we are suiting and appealing to the broader learner and types of learners. And I suppose when you have a professional program, there are competency pieces that you need to think about as well, and ensuring that you can actually assess those in a meaningful way. So having, as I said, that vision and knowing where you want to get to, designing it then. So there are rules and regulations around assessment about ensuring validity, reliability, trust, fairness, all of those principles that we all adhere to when we have to set out our various criteria for assessments, our rubric design, our measures, making sure that we have all of those in place, making sure that we have our that we've thought about all of the aspects, and I suppose that we've communicated that effectively to students as well, so that they know what we're about and what's expected of them. And then in relation to, I suppose, the final piece then, it's how do you deliver it? So what do you need to do to actually deliver this vision that you have for assessment in a blended learning? Training of faculty is probably crucial, and in the examples that you'll hear, you will hear about how much input actually had to happen, and how much professional development we had to do with staff to ensure that they were up to speed with the changes and with the various pieces of assessment that were changing. Student engagement, again, buy-in from the student population is really important. Assessment is a vehicle for student learning. It's really at the crux of everything, and there's a phrase that students can avoid bad teaching, but they can't avoid bad assessment design. So making sure that students understand that they're engaged and that you have gone through surveying and processes and reflecting with them. Creating, I suppose, in a blended learning environment, creating learning spaces and thinking about that differently. So, we have drop-in webinars whereby students can actually drop into the lecture if they have a particular question around assessment. We have assessment forums. They can type in the question and the forum will be answered within 24 hours. We have shared sessions with them. So there's lots of different ways in a blended learning environment that you can support students through the assessment journey, and thinking about those learning spaces differently, and thinking about the peer learning and the collaborative learning, and those spaces is really important as well for students. Obviously, administration is key as well, making sure that you have, as I said before, the gradebook set up, the where they submit, who submits them, when they submit them. We would, for example, always have a submission date at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, whereby we would then sort of say, well, look, we give them a half an hour's grace period in case there's Wi-Fi problems or in case there's difficulties for them. And the IT team are ready at 3 o'clock to know that X number of 100 assignments are coming in, and they're on call with tech support. They're answering their queries when students can't upload. So as I said, there has to be that collective shared strategy and approach to ensuring that students are supported. So I suppose just to maybe elaborate a little bit more on some of these processes, I'm going to move to the next slide, which is discovering. And what do I mean by discovering? And I think an important part of living in a digital world in that blended environment is to use the data that you already have. So we talk about learning analytics, measuring, collecting, analyzing data, reporting data of student progress. And it is incredible that, students who are in that digital world generate a huge amount of data. Now, obviously, ethically, you will have to ensure that you've gone through the proper procedures to use the data. But for example, we have a ticketing service, and I've just put up there, in any given period, and this was over a period of time, you can look at what students were querying, and you can see there, for example, assignments was 451, so it was very high. After the general queries, school placement or school experience was obviously high as well. So as a college, we need to sort of say to ourselves, okay, well, let's break that down. Let's see, what were the students asking about the assignments? Was it simply about uploads? Was it technical support they needed? Was it more academic support they needed? Did they have administrative problems? So you use your data to inform what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. And I'll just move on to the next slide there to just show you a little bit more about how you can use the data. So our students come on the program as postgraduate students, and for many of them, maybe they haven't been, engaged in academia for quite a while. And one of the first subjects they face when they come in is foundations of education, which is psychology, sociology, philosophy. So pretty academic heavy subject areas where they're back to academic writing, maybe having been away from it. So we developed an academic writing toolkit, and we tracked the progress of how students were using that academic toolkit. And many students reported back that they were struggling with being back in that academic world. And we thought about formative assessment. Okay, so what could we do that would be a formative piece of assessment that would support these students on this assessment journey and would really help them? And so we put in our academic writing toolkit, we put in a formative piece of assessment. And you can see the spike there on the graph that all of those students actually all hit that formative assessment piece. So we knew that that was something they valued, that was something that they really got benefit from. And it was able to inform us then to look at better ways of supporting students through formative assessment. So it really is important to use your data to inform the design of what you're going to do. Another area, I'll just move on to just show you what you can actually do. The next slide. So another interesting thing to do is to conduct an assessment audit. So here you look at, across our cohorts, across each of our modules, we tracked the types of assessments that we were engaging students in. And we wanted to see that from the point of view of variety and types of assessments. So we weren't relying on simply essays. Obviously, essay critical writing was important to us in certain subject areas, but we started to move towards, comparative analysis of resources, students creating their own digital resources. Obviously, lesson plans is important for us in the work that our student teachers were going to be doing, but designing units of learning, short courses, designing elements of what they would be doing when they would be out in school. So making sure that there was a work-based or that the assessments related to what they were going to be doing in their ultimate careers as a professional teacher. And I think it's a really good exercise for anyone to do, is to look, as I said, across a number of years, across the modules, and ensure that you have a range and type, and you begin to see then, should we mix it up more? Could we include more, as I say, multimedia presentations or vlogging or blogs or what we could do? But you don't get that sense of it unless you actually sit down and discover and look at and do that audit, because then it informs the richness of where you go with your teaching and assessment strategy. So just to move on.
Mary, just to say you have about 2 minutes left.
Oh gosh, sorry, I'll fly through these then. So yeah, so dreaming of the assessment. So what you want to do, you want to be innovative, you want to create excitement, you want to engage students. As I said, assessment is absolutely critical. And if you go on to the next slide there, you'll just see the myriad of opportunities. Like all of those there are all areas that you can use ICT to support assessment, to support your Kahoots, quizzes, MCQs, rating scales, worksheet. Like there's an absolute myriad, but it is important, as I said from the beginning, that it's the pedagogy and the learning outcomes, and that is what drives your use of those. But there's so much out there, and I think it is, you know, it is a time to be creative. It is a time to be innovative. Students have the devices, and you can work with your teams to ensure those. Some of those tools that are there are very simple things like Kahoot, like, you know, whereas then you have more I suppose expensive ones in some respects, like Mahara, where you'd have e-portfolios or digital portfolios where students are keeping their work as they go along, if it's a continuous assessment program. So I suppose dream big, but always mindful of where you want to get to, what you want to achieve. You know, here's some of the questions. You know, what are your strategic aims? What points for improvement have been identified? So when you do have your external boards, your program boards, what points are coming back to you around assessment? What learning outcomes are you trying to achieve? What context will they take place? What technologies are available to you? What support do you need? And what are you already doing well? So it's, you know, it's important. I think sometimes we don't take stock and say, well, actually that is working very, very well, and we'll hold on to that, but maybe we won't. And I think that was Peter's point around, I think there's some of what has happened with COVID, which absolutely we will take with us and move forward. And then there's some of it that we might leave behind. So just to move on to the next slide then, I think, as I said, assessment is the engine which drives student learning. And I think that's really, really important. In some respects, you know, it's like the puppeteer. You can actually manage the student through the assessment process, but it's not, it has to be good, it has to be robust, it has to be underpinned by principles which are fair and valid. And the next slide will just, because I'm conscious of the time now, just, you know, it's more than grades. It's about driving student learning. It's about providing feedback for both tutors and students. And it is a holistic process that you have to embrace. And when you sit down to design any assessment, those principles have to be at the core of what you want to do. And just the next slide.
Can you see that, Mary? I moved it on.
No, I can't actually. There's obviously I think I have them here myself anyway. So just I suppose in designing assessments, as I said, you know, provide opportunities for students to peer assess, to review, to have varied and inclusive ones, to look for self-assessment opportunities, and to build in reflective tasks. I think that's really become important. There's a reflective piece to everything a student does to help them evaluate and progress towards their own learning goals. And the next one, I suppose, you know, delivering it then, professional development for faculty is crucial. And you'll hear from the examples that, as I said, that we've spoken about, or that you'll hear from. We spent a lot of time on the professional development for faculty, making sure that they were IT savvy, making sure that they had the technical support, but also then making sure that they understood the changes and the frameworks that we were using to assess students. It's really important, I suppose, in delivering as well to respond to student feedback. And that's easily done in a blended learning environment. You know, short Kahoot quizzes, short questionnaires, really instant feedback that you can get even on polls. We use Zoom, for example, and you know, you can do an instant poll as to what students felt about something. Obviously, I've mentioned it, and I can't stress enough, the IT infrastructure has to be there to support assessment in a blended learning environment. The quality assurance frameworks have to be there. And I've mentioned student feedback there again, because it is absolutely crucial. There's no point in us doing it if students are not engaged with it and if they're not responding to it. And I suppose some final thoughts. I really believe that quality learning comes when there's coherence and alignment between the technology, the course environment, the learning objectives, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment demands of a course. There has to be that alignment back to that initial slide that I showed. Effective practice in blending learning requires selecting the most appropriate tools for the purpose of the learning to be achieved. And it's the learning and then choosing the appropriate ones for that. I think the adoption of blended learning should ideally exploit the technology to promote active and participative learning. And that has really become, I suppose, something that we've all seen. You know, sometimes, you know, in a classroom, there are students who sit there who don't say very much, who don't ask questions. What we have discovered is that when we're using technology, when we're using the likes of Zoom, the students are in the chat box all the time, refining, evaluating, reflecting on their learning, and getting instant kind of, you know, opportunities. And they would sometimes students who wouldn't say anything in a classroom. So the technology has, I suppose, has promoted that active engagement. And I suppose really what you want to do is to have ongoing review and evaluation. And that's something that we have done consistently, that we sit back and say, well, look, what has worked, what hasn't worked, where is it going well, what do we need to do, what do we need to do for students and for staff, just to ensure that the quality is maintained and that the standards are continuously being met. So I suppose there are just some thoughts on the overall principles that can underpin and I suppose ensure that we are developing and moving in the right direction with assessment in a blended learning environment. So I'm going to pass to Aisling now, who's going to give you, I suppose, quite a practical example of something we've done in the college over the past months to respond to the situation we've found ourselves in.
Thanks, Mary. I'm just going to try and share my slides first of all before I start. So hopefully you'll all be able to see these. So maybe just somebody let me know you can see the slides.
Yes, we can see those now, Aisling. Thank you.
Great, that's brilliant. Thank you. So hello, everybody. My name is Aisling Reast, and for those that don't know me, I'm the registrar at Hibernia College. It's great to see lots of familiar faces online today and also lots of new people. In my short presentation, I'm going to talk about the quality assurance processes that underpin assessment at Hibernia College, and in particular, how the college adjusted the operation of one particular assessment once it became clear that modifications were going to be needed due to the public health restrictions in place this year. So Hibernia College is a blended learning higher education institution, so we were really lucky in that due to the pre-existing blended nature of our programmes, the requirement for alternative delivery methods due to COVID-19 has been minimal. College staff are experienced in both developing and delivering blended learning, and significant timetable adjustments haven't been required. And many of the assessments of our programmes also didn't require modification, as our programmes have a strong emphasis on continuous assessment. However, the exceptions to these were examinations and placement assessments, where alternative mechanisms needed to be found. The first and perhaps most urgent change was in relation to the oral Irish examinations on our professional masters in primary education programme. And so for the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to focus on the modifications we made to this assessment and the quality assurance mechanisms that underpinned that change. So these exams are normally held in the spring and summer each year in 3 centres around the country. And typically over 600 students are assessed over the spring and summer session. Each of our candidates is assessed by 2 assessors at the same time. So as you can imagine, this necessitates the need for a large panel of trained assessors. As you can therefore imagine, this is normally quite a logistical challenge for our assessments and awards office, but one that they are very experienced in delivering. The first session typically takes place in April, so as you can guess, when the lockdown happened, we had to make a decision very quickly to move these examinations online. Unfortunately, the April examinations were the smaller of our 2 cohorts, so we were really glad to be starting with this group. I think Mary spoken earlier about the importance of team effort, and this was absolutely clear in this project. So we established a project group between the registry department, the School of Education and our IT department, but close liaison was also needed with lots of others across the college, such as our student support, the quality office and our faculty manager. 4 key sets of requirements were identified: the academic, the technical, governance and support. And the academic requirements were looked after by my colleagues in the School of Education, so I'm going to focus on the other 3 in this presentation. Firstly, the technical requirements. So this involved setting up nearly 200 individual Zoom meetings for the April session and over 500 for the July session. Individual meetings were chosen as it reduced the risk of the wrong candidate appearing in the wrong session and the consequent allocation of the wrong mark to the wrong student. Waiting rooms were enabled so that assessors could ensure that they were ready before admitting candidates, and so that the students could log in well in advance, reducing the risk of last-minute glitches. We scheduled an excess number of sessions, as this allowed our Assessments and Awards Office to move our candidates and assessors into later rescheduled sessions should there be a technical difficulty or something else going wrong during an examination. In previous years, when we've held events in live venues, typically the exams, I suppose, run back to back. We thought it was quite important to have a little bit of extra time between these online sessions in case of any delays due to technical difficulties, and also to allow our assessors who are no longer sitting together to have a little bit of time online together in the marking of performance between examinations. We also made a decision to record the examinations. Recording the exams supported us to implement some contingencies that I'll talk to in a few minutes when technical difficulties arose, and it also allowed us to review sessions, for example, if there was queries regarding exam integrity issues arising. One of the differences we made technically between our spring exams and our summer exams is that we introduced a new scheduling tool called OnceHub. This tool allowed our students to choose their own examination time on a first come first served basis, and given the very large number of candidates and the huge challenges of the times that we're living in, we really believe that it was important for our students to select a time that worked for them. Once our students booked their session, the tool sent them their individual Zoom link for their exam, and students that didn't select a session, and there was really just less than a handful of these, they were very quick to select their sessions, were allocated a time by the Assessments and Awards Office. And that office was then able to draw down a report with the Zoom links and distribute them to the assessor panels for the examinations. Examination integrity was the key governance consideration. Moving oral examinations online was a brand new experience for the college, and ensuring academic integrity was of paramount importance. Guidelines for these examinations were written to support both our students and our assessors, and to ensure that academic integrity was preserved. The regulations for online oral examinations that you can see at the moment on the screen are published on the Hibernia College Quality Framework, which has recently moved to a new innovative platform at the address you can see below, which is qualityframework.hiberniacollege.com. These regulations open with an academic integrity statement, reinforcing the importance of integrity within these examinations. Part B sets out how candidates can prepare for the examinations, including testing their equipment against the technical requirements for the exam and preparing the examination environment. This section includes regulations in relation to the visibility of the student, ensuring they're not alone, and positioning of both the student and their technical equipment. Part C talks about the regulations to be followed during the examination, including those in relation to attendance, candidate verification, recording of the examinations, and the steps to be taken in the event that technical difficulties arose. It has a detailed section on securing the examination environment. So this includes how students demonstrate the security of their environment by moving their laptop or web camera around, as instructed by the assessors, to show their compliance with the regulations. For example, showing that they don't have notes or unauthorised materials in the room and that they're alone in the room. It also sets out that candidates may be asked to share their screen with assessors throughout the examination to ensure that no unauthorised applications are open. Finally, it outlines the procedures to be followed in the event that a candidate is suspected to be in breach of examination regulations. An on-screen declaration was used for students. So students who came into the virtual exam room were required to tick that they accepted certain conditions prior to their room admittance. So things like that they had familiarised themselves with the regulations, had removed unauthorised materials, wouldn't communicate with anyone other than the assessors, and had closed applications other than Zoom. For the first time, many of our assessors were going to also be carrying out an invigilation role, and so guidelines for the invigilation of online oral examinations were developed to assist them to undertake this role. Again, these guidelines open with academic integrity really at the forefront of both sets of governance documents, enforcing the importance of this in these examinations. The next most important thing in these guidelines is information on support. We wanted our assessors to be able to contact the Assessments and Awards Office quickly in the event of any examination incidents. The section on examination preparation includes a requirement for assessors to complete specific IT training that was required for these examinations and to test that they can meet the technical requirements. The roles and responsibilities of each of the two assessors are defined, and there are also requirements set for the assessor's environment, so ensuring, for example, that they can be seen and heard by the candidates. Guidelines then move to the examination itself, so including steps to take if the student is late or doesn't turn up at all. Assessors are guided on how to welcome the candidates and how to verify their identification. They're advised on the visual checks and the verbal confirmations that are required to ensure that the candidate's examination environment is secure. Guidance is provided on the management of matters arising during the examination. So, for example, in relation to the visibility of the candidate, or either loss of the candidate or the assessor's connection, and management of extenuating circumstances. For example, supporting a student who is distressed or anxious. Finally, the guidelines set out the steps to be taken if an assessor develops concerns regarding academic integrity during the examination. So, for example, if somebody walks into the room during the exam, or if the candidate is assessing unauthorised materials. To further support this transition to the new model of oral assessment, a number of additional assessment mechanisms were, support mechanisms were implemented. Technical support included the scheduling of Zoom drop-in sessions for those who wanted to test their equipment and learn more about Zoom functionality. Help desk phone lines and emails were also highly resourced and monitored over the duration of the exams. Training and support sessions were held to ensure familiarity with the guidelines and regulations, and the School of Education provided academic and assessment support. Feedback from these sessions really set out that these helped ensure that assessors and students were upskilled and confident in their ability to achieve the assessment criteria. One of the changes we made between the spring and summer examinations was that as we were bringing on a number of new assessors to deal with the larger panel of candidates that were going to be taking part in this examination session, we paired new assessors with experienced buddy assessors so that they felt supported as they undertook their roles. As part of our quality assurance mechanisms, incidents and their resolutions were recorded across both examination settings. There was a lower proportion of incidents, as you can see, in the summer session, and anecdotally, we'd probably put that down to the increased experience of our assessors, increased student familiarity with technology, and the modifications that we made to our training and support based on the learnings from the previous spring session. Technical difficulties occurred in a small number of candidates or assessors in each session, actually probably far less than we would have predicted. We would have thought that there would have been more issues arising. In some cases, the difficulties were sufficient for us to reschedule the exams, typically later in the day. In other cases, the recording was reviewed and it was considered that actually whatever technical difficulty had arisen didn't impact on the fair conduct of the exam, so there was no further action required. And in a small number of cases, it resulted in one of the two assessors being late to the examination. And in these cases, simply what happened was that the recording was reviewed by both assessors before the grading happened. In a small number of cases, students couldn't present their student card identification, and this is typically because of travel restrictions during lockdowns and people not being able to get to them. So we had mechanisms for verifying identification that were alternative in those cases. There was 5 queries regarding academic integrity raised across both sessions. For example, in one session, there was an assessor who'd noticed that a student was wearing a headset late on into the examination. In these cases, recordings of the examinations were reviewed. And student welfare issues arose with 3 students, 2 of whom who had extenuating circumstances, and we got support from our colleagues in student support in these incidents. Following the grading process, we had a look at the outcomes that students achieved in these examinations when compared with those held in live venues last year. So if you have a look at these two slides, the 2017 intake students were the students who were examined in live face-to-face venues in 2019, whereas the 2018 intake students were the students who were assessed online. And I suppose both, to give you a sense, both of those examinations take place towards the end of the student programme. So that's why the intake numbers appear a little bit early. We were really happy to note that there was no change in the pass rate across these very large numbers of students, and the grade band outcomes were largely consistent, other than a couple of small changes in two or three of the grade bands. Other assessment changes which took place have included replacing a written examination with a synchronous online examination, included introducing reflective online interview process for school placement assessment, and some modifications to our. As Mary mentioned, all of our alternative assessments are aligned to our learning outcomes, and the college consults with our external examiners when we're making these changes, including at our exam boards and our programme boards. They're then brought to our academic board for approval, and we also regularly engage with the teaching council before notification to QQI of the changes that we made. Feedback continues to be sought from staff and learners on the effectiveness of new assessment arrangements. Mechanisms include surveys, engagements in our governance committees, and just ad hoc feedback. And I just added in a couple of comments, one from a student and one from a staff member, regarding these new assessment mechanisms, which I think support the broad acceptance of these methodologies. So, lessons learned. Significant planning, training and administration is needed to move processes online, particularly at short notice, as we had earlier on this year. However, these processes do seem to be acceptable to learners and to staff. As Mary mentioned, there may be a role for continued provision of some processes that we previously delivered face-to-face online, or maybe a mixed provision, but certainly it's something we need to look at. Having excellent technical support and IT infrastructure, we think, is an absolutely critical success factor. And finally, development of detailed guidelines supports the delivery of new assessment methodologies. Before I conclude, I must express my thanks to the project team for their collaboration in implementing these online oral examinations. Particular thanks to my colleagues in the School of Education and the IT department, who I don't think had ever been so involved in assessment before, and also to other college, including our faculty manager. Special thanks are also due to members of my team, Ruth and Michael, and the Assessment and Awards Office team, some of which I can see online today. So they did a huge amount of work in this area. Finally, a few references. The College Quality Framework, which includes the regulations we developed. So if you want to have a look at them, you can click on there and have a see. And of course, the QQI Statutory Quality Assurance Guidelines for providers of blended learning programmes, and the QQI Guiding Principles for Alternative Assessments, both of which guided our implementation of these changes, and both of which you might have spotted I quoted throughout the presentation. That concludes my piece. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisling. Just to say that we have questions again at the end. I'd like to invite Melanie Dhuinn, Assistant Professor in the Education Department at Trinity College, to make her presentation now. Melanie?
Yeah, can I just get my slides?
Take your time.
Okay.
So keep adding your questions into the chat, and we'll bring those to the speakers at the end. And I note that some of you want to get copies of the PowerPoint presentation. We'll ask the speakers for permission for that at the end too.
Sorry, just give me one moment, please. Okay.
Yeah, something is coming.
Okay. Okay, so you might just give me an indication you can see that, please?
See it now. Yep, yeah, very clear.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming along. I'm delighted to be here with you. So both Mary and Aisling have obviously focused on the strategic and the operational pieces around the reimagining that we had to undertake in the last number of months. So I'm going to go with a practical focus in mine, and I'm going to talk about it from a teacher education perspective and how we have had to reimagine the teaching, learning and assessment spaces through that COVID prism. And I'm really going to focus in the main on school placement as a case in point and as a particular module. Okay, so as we all know, on the 12th of March, when the whole thing shut down and we basically were catapulted out of our face-to-face environments and had to move online, it was very disorientating at the time for us. So within teacher education, one of the biggest challenges that we had were where we had students on school placement who had not been fully assessed whilst on that placement, and the schools closed and the placements ended, and it was very abrupt and very disorientating, to put it mildly. But we had to make emergency modifications at that point in time, and we did, and we managed to modify assessment to get those students through and to graduate them at the required quality and also in line with the learning outcomes. So from that then, we obviously found ourselves hoping that come September we might have had more face-to-face engagement with student teachers, certainly in the schools, but unfortunately that wasn't to be, as we know. And we then found ourselves in the whole debate and the whole introduction of a new lexicon even around, Hibernia College is no stranger to the term blended learning, but believe it or not, in the university sector, it's not probably as well understood perhaps as it certainly is in Hibernia College. So there's a very I suppose, solid understanding that it's a mixture of, or a blend of, the face-to-face and the online that gives you the blended learning. So in lots of ways, it's a bit like a good cup of tea. All right, if the blend is right, you get an optimal output on it. But that said, within teacher education in particular, because it's a professional program and because the practicum element of it is such a huge part of the program, there's a lot of credits in the program for that. It posed significant challenges for us. And as we knew then, as we moved into the new semester of this academic year, we basically had to look and say, okay, we need to modify here. Now, one thing that was in our favour that we didn't have in March was that the students themselves were actually teaching face-to-face in school, and we were really lucky that that was the case. So that was an improvement, and that put us in a better position. On the academic side of it and on the institutional side of it, however, from a school placement perspective, we couldn't actually go into a school to do face-to-face visits, which is what we always had done. And that left us totally, having to reimagine, rethink and work it out, from our end. And what it also entailed was it entailed a complete reconceptualization of the assessment in line with the learning outcomes as they were accredited. But it also entailed significant input and investment in staff training. And more than that, and I'm going to talk about this a bit more, trying to get people's minds to shift from the culture that we were used to, where it was face-to-face, where you go into your school, you do your observation with your student teacher, you have that face-to-face conversation afterwards, and then you end up that we can't do it. So there was a lot of anxiety, certainly within, our own staff, even within our school placement tutors, who we draw from practicing teachers and teachers who have retired, but who work in the field of teacher education. And the whole concept around how is this going to be done on a computer? How are we going to manage this on a device? We have to see these people teach. We have to be able to validate that they have met the learning outcomes and that they're demonstrating that. So there's a lot of anxiety around that, and there's a lot of soul searching, a lot of head scratching at the time. So we do obviously work within the environment of having, and we're lucky to have a very good virtual learning environment. In Trinity, we use Blackboard Learn as the learning environment. Within that, we have teleconferencing tools. That was extended where we then got to use Teams and more recently Zoom. has become available to us. So from an ICT perspective and from a support perspective, there was a lot of support afforded to us. So there was lots of tools there, and there was lots of functionality within those tools, which was a good thing for us. From the school placement perspective, the face-to-face element of the blend was with the students who remained, as I said, in schools on the placement aspect of it. But for us at the institutional level, and very importantly from a quality assurance perspective, we're an accredited programme professionally and academically validated within the university. We had to ensure that the standards were still met with the same learning outcomes but in a different way. So that constructive alignment that Mary referred to in her presentation at the start, where we have the teaching, learning and assessment and the reflective piece in it, that was always going to be there. So that in itself did, and that was under that umbrella, there was a lot of things coming together. What did have to change, however, was how we looked at it and how we decided we were going to seek out the evidence that the students could demonstrate that they had met the learning outcomes and that we could validate their learning then. So if we kind of look at the assessment cycle first, because this is one of the first things we did, we looked at the whole concept of, the actual assessment cycle. So the learning outcomes were there. This wasn't like at the beginning of a program we had to go and rewrite the learning outcomes. We had them. They were all there. A lot of them were set up in such a way that they would probably manifest better within the face-to-face environment. But we did have that, and we do have that to hand because the students are in school. The planning then around the teaching, the delivery, setting tasks, and very importantly, the rubrics that were going to capture that learning and that were going to identify the success criteria for us. They had to all be redone from scratch, basically. Then into the phase, and it's the phase we're at now, and I know Hibernia College are at that formative piece of checking for learning and progression, and we are assessing as it stands. From that assessment, we'll gather evidence and data. We'll then use that to analyse and to reflect at a later stage. And we'll be going into another round of it then, or another iteration. And within that, we will have to probably revise what we've done slightly, maybe refine it a little bit and act, because the important thing on the basis of the feedback and the reflections that we have is that we don't ignore where we can make changes for the better. So in terms of reimagining or redesigning or reconceptualizing, there's a number of constants, all right, that stay the same and that are pretty much immovable. Those mainly are the programme and the module learning outcomes. Okay, they are what they are, they're set. And obviously the credits that are aligned to each of those models are also set. And for us, our 2 school placement modules are 20 ECTS each. So that's a lot of credits, it's a lot of student effort, for the students. The variables that we had time to move, or we had an opportunity to move with, our inputs in terms of our tasks that we would set, activities, the tools and the functionalities using discussion boards, using blogs, using cooperative groups, and the rubrics associated with that. We had opportunity there. Looking at the outputs then from the student end of it, the evidence of learning, looking at the overall portfolios, the demonstration of teaching, the reflections, and then looking at the modes of assessment and ensuring that we still maintained a balance between the assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning as we progress through it. Okay, so where did we start then? So right through July and August, this work was ongoing because we were mindful that it was most likely that we were going to be in this situation at that point in time. We obviously had the other plan, which was the default, but that didn't come to pass. Something probably that might seem a little bit strange now. I'm going to say we started at the end, all right? So we started by reflecting back, okay, to what we had done previously and what we had done in the emergency modifications that we'd used. And Mesro talks about validation being the central function of reflection. So we reflected, all right? And we used that reflection then to actually see where could we follow forward with. Mesro's whole concept of the theory of transformative learning, you know, it talks about getting through, but we have to reflect first to make the transformation and to move it through. And he believed it was a very fundamental part of progressive development, and it's the root of the individual development for pedagogues and students. All right, so we understood well that there was a different learning experience coming. There had to be different assessment with it, but ultimately we had to still achieve the learning outcomes. So Ted Fleming famously talks about, and Mesro talks about, this disorientating dilemma that we get in transformative learning. And boy, did we get a disorientating dilemma when COVID hit. All right, everything, all the tables were turned on us. We were completely thrown, you know, in terms of what we knew to be familiar, and we found it very, very difficult. And our staff found it difficult, and our students found it difficult. But what we were somewhat encouraged by is the whole concept that that disorientating dilemma is like a catalytic moment, all right, in that it pushes it forward, all right, and we do get out the other side of it. So to go back to what might seem like brass tacks and very basic, you know, pedagogy as such, in terms of redesigning the delivery and the assessment of the modules, we go back and we had a look at the Bloom's taxonomy, all right, and looking from the, you know, the first level of that to remember right up to the create piece at the very end. And it's no harm, and you know, with student teachers, we have to teach them how to teach, and in that we also have to be role models for them in the way that we do that. So for us as the teacher educators, it was no harm whatsoever to go back and to refamiliarize ourselves with what exactly to be able to do. All right, the learning outcomes were there, but we had to go back and look at it from the beginning. So the next slide, it's not my slide, it's one I've borrowed. It's basically looking at again, Bloom, but looking at all the different ways in which student teachers could basically come to the point where they could demonstrate that they had hit the threshold of the learning outcomes at the minimum of a pass or above it. And there was lots of opportunities within that, and that's what we looked at. So we had to modify the assessment. All right, so essentially for the school placement year 1 PME and year 2 PME, and the year 2s are going through, they're on the placement at the moment. What they had was school placement performance in a 10-week block. It was assessed face-to-face. Each student used to have 2 school placement tutors, and they would get 3 visits, 2 visits from one and 1 visit from the second one as a crossover or moderation. They also then would have uploaded their portfolio to Blackboard. Okay, and in one way that was, they would have been uploading their lesson plans and their reflections to Blackboard all along, but that was their engagement really with the online platform. That was the sense of blend that they had. So that has now been modified too. So the current year 1 students have 40 hours of online lectures. Okay, they have 2 hours on a Thursday and 2 hours on a Friday. Within that, they do some micro teaching. So we're using the VLE. They've never met each other face to face. They never met me face to face, but we all know each other very well at this stage. They're set up in cooperative learning groups on the virtual learning environment, and they're actually teaching in small groups on the VLE, critiquing on the VLE, and using the tools that are there, such as the blog, the discussion board. They record the sessions, and they apply the critique rubric to it. After Christmas, all right, they will be out in school on that big 10-week block. But the benefit for them this time around, and I see it as a big benefit, is they have had the opportunity to engage in small group micro teaching over the last number of weeks, and it does prepare them, all right, for that classroom situation. And initially, to be very honest, at the start, we were thinking, how are we going to get them any teaching experience whatsoever before they actually go out into a school? So within the 10-week placement block, and our year 2s have this at the moment, we modified to have 4 assessment points, all online, all right, which meant that our school placement tutors don't to schools at all. We all work online to do it. So the first one, and I know Hibernia College did this as well, is they have an assessment point on reflections. So they have to use a Brookfield lens model. They have to upload 1 reflection per week over a 10-week period. Those are formative. They get some feedback on those as they're uploading them, but they will also have a summative reflection, which they will upload in January. And they're working through what you're hoping to do is improve as they practice with the reflections as they go through the school placement piece. They will have 2 online visits with their school placement tutors, and that again is guided by a quality framework and by a rubric that is shared with the students beforehand, and obviously a lot of training and input with the tutors beforehand as well. They'll always have the professional development portfolio. We had to modify the rubric on that slightly because the part of that would have been reflection before, but we've taken that out of it to put that in as assessment point and so on. And the big piece at the end for them is that online viva, a viva voce, so an online examination, oral examination with 2 school placement tutors following the rubric. So just that's a very different way for us to have assessed or to assess our school placement module. One of the big things, I suppose, really big changes micro-teaching part of it. So for those of us who were in teacher education college a long time ago, micro-teaching was very much in vogue then, and it still is, because it's a very solid and a safe space to get student teachers used to planning, used to use learning outcomes, used to writing learning intentions out to critique, to demonstrate within a very small group. That has worked well, but it has required significant support from the technical, the technology aspect of it. Sometimes they get lost and they end up in the wrong room, but more often than not, everybody is where they're supposed to be. They check in, they're becoming, you know, every time they do it, they become more adept at it, and it's working very, very well. The reflections and the reflective practice piece, they always find this difficult. Students find reflecting, student teachers find that difficult. The Brookfield lenses is the 4 lenses. They have found that probably more difficult than the micro-teaching, to be fair. They find it difficult to see outside themselves, but we have pushed with them. But there has been extensive support, provision of exemplars, additional rubrics created, and a lot of support on the discussion board, which is the asynchronous piece of it, as they go through it. Within the school placement block, obviously, they are teaching in schools. So this is actually a solid example of blended learning. They have that face-to-face during the day, and then obviously their interaction with us is in the evening. So the year 2s, I meet them every Monday evening for a debrief after school, and we go through, it's structured, obviously, a lot of the time there's attention to the assessment criteria, success criteria, but also giving them enhanced strategies to manage while they're actually in the classroom and to progress through. I suppose the big one, which hasn't happened yet for any of them, is the Viva. So the Viva will be on Teams. The 2 school placement tutors who will already have met their student individually on Teams for the formative feedback sessions, they will be there in that together with the student. So a very strict and tight rubric around that, learning outcomes, success criteria identified. External examiner will be present in some of those as well from a quality assurance perspective, and all of the modifications I've mentioned here obviously had to go through all of the quality assurance processes in the university. They had to be moved towards the dean to be approved and to be signed off, and literally and examined at close quarter as should be the case. But ultimately, we are now in a position where we have a modified assessment, which we can see coming through, we can see it working. That's not to say everybody is happy about it. We still have some students stuck in that disorientating dilemma that Meserow talks about. We still have some staff that are stuck in it. But it's only, as we know, when you work through these lived experiences and lived examples that we can actually really comment on it in the end. So just to briefly, before I finish, just to go back to the whole Meserow thing, Fleming talks about the beliefs, truths, that it's our meaning-making apparatus. So it's what makes sense to us. We're used to with the original assessment protocols for school placements. So it's that filing cabinet in our head that we know exactly what has to happen. But when COVID hit, And particularly with the professional program that we have in the Professional Master of Education, those meetings just didn't work. And we were forced into a situation through that jolt or this disorientation dilemma where we had to rethink, and we had to say, okay, we have to move out of this and we have to come up with a solution for it. So we have reimagined how our student teachers learn and acquire their critical thinking skills, both in the synchronous and the asynchronous spaces. Similar to what Aisling and Mary said, there's quite a lot of what we're doing now that hopefully post-COVID that we'll hang on to, because the depth and the quality and the breadth of experience that the students are getting in it is really, you know, it's quite impressive, and it will further prepare them to become teachers in the classroom, you know, and what they're going to have to do. Ultimately, you know, in teacher education, it's the sum of the parts or the totality that eventually brings you to the point where you can validate that this student is ready to progress on to now be a newly qualified teacher. So the online experience for us, in terms of the assessment and the blended piece from the classroom, has been challenging. It certainly has presented lots of headaches for us along the way, and lots of late nights and early mornings from all sorts of perspectives, but we're getting there and we're getting through it. I suppose, just if I was to finish, you know, in terms of like, what would we maybe advise, you know, in terms of looking at it again, and again, conscious of, you know, when we reflect at the end of this, other things will come through. Ultimately, we have to be guided by the learning outcomes. They're pre-designed, preordained, they're there, okay? And that's good, because they offer us a scaffold and a support. We have to look at the assessment differently, and that is, we have to adjust our mindsets and adjust culturally before to bring us to where we need to be. We always have to look for the evidence, all right, that students are achieving those, and we constantly have to reflect. The students have to reflect and we have to reflect. So I've kind of gone through very, very quickly there something that has probably taken a couple of months to get together, that we're in the middle of at the moment. We don't underestimate the challenge of it. We know it, we live it every day, but we are reasonably confident, okay, that it will succeed, and that the students will progress on, and most importantly, we can stand over the quality assurance of it.
Thank you very much, Melanie. That was really fascinating, as were the three presentations. I was involved in that teaching, learning and assessment report QQI did during the summer, and we were really impressed with what we saw there. And you know, it's really impressive to see how things have moved on, and the quality of the thinking underpinning the modifications that people have made. And it's also encouraging to see that some of this will continue on afterwards. So what I want to do now is move on to interference there, I think. Okay. Could you mute your microphones if you're not speaking until we, yeah.
Peter, you're muted as well. Sorry.
What I want to do now is go back through the chat and pick out some questions for the three speakers. And the first thing I'd like to do is just confirm that can we have the overheads, or not the overheads, but the showing my age, the PowerPoint presentations? Yes, I take that as a yes. Secondly, a question for Mary. Mary, this is a question from John Lafferty from SQT. What were the top 5 actions that are required in order to ensure that learners' work in response to the assignments is genuine and free from plagiarism? So I suppose it's a question about academic integrity, and what are your top 5 suggestions on academic integrity?
And I'll defer to my Aisling here as well, insofar as she's on the Academic Integrity Network now, so she'll have that. I suppose there's a number of things. the assessments change on a regular basis. I think that's really important. So, for example, in our case, we would be asking students to create assignments maybe for a third class or a fourth class or a sixth class or a junior infant. So we regularly change the assignments to ensure that they are relevant for that particular cohort, so that there isn't an opportunity to do that. We use Urkund very strongly. I suppose that is something that we're and we used Turnitin previously, so we've a good strong history of ensuring that there is that consistency. We train our tutors to look out for it, and I think that's really important as well. We do an awful lot of professional development with the tutors, and it's amazing actually how tutors who are correcting spot things that you wouldn't think, and they bring it to our attention and we deal with it then. We spend a lot of time with our students in terms of academic integrity as well. We provide workshops for them. The academic toolkit was hugely important for us as well, in showing them, I suppose, and guiding them and supporting them in a good way, as opposed to trying to catch them out. So teaching them the skills of referencing and really ensuring that they are fully aware themselves of the consequences of it. Look, like all institutions, we have had our difficulties, and sometimes I think when you're in a professional program, there are so many resources for teachers, for example, online. So it's very easy sometimes for students to just go on and find something very quickly and think that. So you really have to invest a lot of time in supporting them and realizing them and giving them the skills to realize that actually, you know what, it's there, yes, but reference it properly and do the proper things. So they're the kind of key things. I'm not sure, Aisling, is there anything I've left that you feel?
No, I think you've covered lots of things, Mary, but I think it's down to that kind of integrity first approach that we take across the college. So as Mary says, we engage with our students in a positive manner about academic integrity early in the programme and often during the programme. And if you look at those guideline documents, it's the first thing that appears for both our students and our assessors. So I think that's a very important approach to it too. The other thing as well is I think we just try to be, positively promote integrity as much as possible. So we had a number of events taking place in the college for the National Academic Integrity Week very recently. And again, that's a cross-college approach. So it's something that really runs to the heart of our engagement with each other and with our students.
Okay, thanks very much. Another question on a different topic from Bronwyn Maloney. Have you, and this is for particularly for Mary Kelly, have you had have you had challenges around timing of assessment across modules?
No, not at all. And I suppose that is, again, that's back to the planning piece at the beginning of the program. So we're a postgraduate program. I think that's important to say as well. So we have mainly continuous assessment. We have one oral Irish exam and we have one written Irish exam. So we can plan the modules and the timing very efficiently. Now, we also then have to factor in school placement, which is done in blocks as well. So it really is taking that holistic view across the 2-year program and sitting down and figuring it out and working out the credits and the hours and all of those things that need to be done at the beginning, and ensuring then that there is ample time for students to have independent study, as well as the webinars and the online sessions and the tutorials and all of that. So I think it's a planning it's a planning thing at the beginning of the program, and we haven't had any challenges, thankfully.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question for Aisling. I hadn't noticed this earlier on. It's also from John Lafferty. It's probably a follow-up on the academic integrity. Can you expand a little, Aisling, on the controls that you applied to written exams? For example, verification of student identity. And somebody else, Aideen Jamil, asked about whether there was any GDPR issues with the ID validation.
Well, I suppose we were lucky enough in that one of the members of the project team that we had, has expertise in data protection. So again, it goes back to that thing that Mary talked about in terms of ensuring that you have buy-in across all of the expertise across the college, so that all of those perspectives come to the fore. What we did very simply in terms of these exams was that students demonstrated their student card, and that was verified on the screen. At the time, the students who didn't have their student cards were able to present something like a passport. And I suppose the advantage again of the fact that we had recorded these examinations was meant that if there was any question around exam integrity, which would include, for example, the wrong person attending the examination, that would be able to be verified and checked against a recording.
Thanks very much. Question for Melanie. This one's from CWI training. Melanie, could you go over how to manage the online assessment?
Yes. So the for the online assessment visits, so the each student has 2 school placement tutors, and the school placement they're set up on teams. So we set up by pedagogy strand on teams. Each school placement tutor has a channel subject teams, and the school placement tutor is responsible for setting up the meeting with the student teacher on Teams, and then the 2 school placement tutors talk to each other after that. Again, because it's a single sign-on through their academic registry validation, that basically they have to validate that they are who they are, but there's a template and a rubric that is shared with the students in advance. Success criteria are advised in advance. I take them for a pre-session on it. I take them as a whole group cohort together. We talk it through, so they're aware of what they have to do. A lot of training, it's like Aisling said and Mary said, the amount of time and effort and energy in staff training and upskilling staff has been considerable, to put it mildly, because a lot of staff are not as adept at using the technology perhaps as they need to be. Now, they learn very quickly, but in terms of getting them set up with their own email account that they can only use a Trinity email account, we have to keep it very, very tight as well. So there's a lot of moving parts, Peter, in that, and a lot of spinning plates at times, okay, and sometimes, you can get, say, somebody thought they were supposed to be where they weren't supposed to be, but ultimately we've an overall spreadsheet on it, and basically we keep an eye on them that way. Most important thing is that every student gets their visits, every student gets them in time, they have ample opportunity to do what they have to do, and that every student feels and does more than feels, gets due process in it. So they're done on Teams, and they're done in that capacity. The students are great with it because they're well used to it. It's basically getting this set up. It's what Mary talked about. The engine behind the whole thing and all the technical support that's needed is quite extensive.
Peter,
Sorry,
you're on mute.
You're muted.
Famous COVID saying of the year, you're on mute. We're over 5 minutes over time at this stage, and I think, to be fair to people starting things at 2 o'clock, I think we leave it at that on the questions at the moment. I might just forward some additional questions by email onto the speakers if people are happy with that, and deal with them that way. So I'd like to thank all the speakers and ask my colleague Karina McGuire to wrap things up for us today.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to Peter, but particular thanks to Mary, Aisling and Melanie. We understand you're under awful pressure at the moment, and it's a big deal to come along and present. Just for everybody else, if there is anyone in the audience that feels they have a good example to share, this is really a kind of a practical approach to trying to provide support at a difficult time for everyone. I think the examples presented here were absolutely perfect for what's required for the QA perspective, and there's a lot of different themes coming up. And one theme, as Mary mentioned earlier on at the beginning of her presentation, is that student engagement. although this is a specific example, there are many transferable pieces. Data, keeping in touch with your students, making sure that there's active participation. So there's a whole range of issues there that are transferable. And we will be sending out a recording of this. We'll send out the PowerPoints, and we'll also send out the list of questions, and we'll ask our presenters today to help us fill in the answers to those and anything else that was mentioned. So so keep an eye out for our next events, and thank you again to Mary, Aisling and Melanie, and best of luck to everybody. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you.